So this is our old cutting board. I actually scavenged it from a donation bin at my brother's house, and it worked really badly, and then the handle broke. And then I decided that it was time to use some of the lumber that we have in our garage and put it to use. We had some cherry and some maple that we had from when we milled down trees to build our house on this property. So I just used some of the scraps and made this butcher block style checkered end grain cutting board. If you enjoyed this video and you like making stuff yourself, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. I cut my strips 1.5 inches wide and a couple inches longer than I needed. And then I ran each of them through the joiner. I only used 9 pieces, but if you want to make sure you get the checkerboard design, make sure you have an even number of pieces to start with. Otherwise, the design won't work and you will have to trim your board like I did. Then I laid them down in the order that I wanted them, which was just light, dark, or alternating between my 2 types of wood, so that I could get the checkerboard design later. Then I flipped them all on their side, with the exception of the first piece, then applied a generous amount of wood glue. I use LePage wood glue, which is pretty common, but Titebond seems to be recommended the most for cutting boards. Then I flipped them all back over one by one and clamped them in place and left them to dry overnight. I ran the whole board through the planer, trimmed the ends, and then cut them into 1.5 inch slices. The width that you cut here will end up being the thickness of your cutting board. I made a quick little jig using a scrap piece of wood and a clamp to make sure that all of my strips were the exact same width. So my pattern didn't work quite the way I had planned. I was going for more of like a checkered board look, but I actually have a dark stripe that goes right through the middle, which would just drive me crazy, even if I flip the boards around. Because when I started, I had an uneven number of strips. I started with 9, so there's always one that will be in the middle no matter which way you flip it. So I'm actually going to make my board a little bit smaller so that I can get that checkered board. So I'm just going to shift every other board, and I'm gonna end up losing 1 square, so it'll be a little bit smaller than I had planned. So note to self, if you're going to make a checkerboard cutting board, you need to start off with an even number of strips. Then lay out your new strips and flip every other piece if you want the checkerboard design. So my initial thought was to run this through the planer, but then I remembered something vaguely about that you're not supposed to run end grain through a planer. So I just did some quick research, and it can cause major tear out and kickback if you run end grain through a planer. So definitely don't do that. Grab your belt sander or your palm sander or whatever you've got on hand and sander down that way. Some people also use their router sled, so that's an option too. That being said, if I had thought of that before, I would have taken a little bit more time to make sure that my pieces were all flat when I glued them together. I used a 1/4 round router bit to clean up the edges, and then used a cove router bit in my router table to make the handles. Alright, so one last thing left to do, oil it. Probably the most fun step, because now you get to watch the colors pop. I use butcher block oil, but you can also use tung oil, mineral oil, or beeswax.